That's one of the amazing things, honestly, about getting to work on Gears is we are a really tight game as our starting point. We feel like as stewards of the franchise and stewards of the gameplay, it's on us not to break that.
We moved from Unreal Engine 3 to Unreal Engine 4, so we had to rebuild systems from scratch, and so how do you make it feel like the previous game? And then once we had that in the can, then we started talking about, okay, now where are the places we can innovate?
Biggest thing that players are going to see when they step into the game is this new combat mechanics, and they all revolve around cover.
You look at what are some of the problems you get into, and that was one of the problems we had with close cover. Like occasionally you get that situation where two people come onto the same piece of cover and it looks kind of silly. It's a naked gun moment of the two pistols, you know, and throwing the guns at each other. We talked about, okay, well, mantle kick is a way now, but how can we make that more skill-based and more aggressive? And that was where vault kick came in. Is there a defensive version of that? And that's where yank came in.
So we have this yank and shank where you can grab a guy, pull him over cover, open them up for this custom execution where you whip out a combat knife, stab it in his face, slit his throat, stab it in the top of his head. I mean, it's Gears, right? People
love the gore in Gears of War, and people love the executions, and so we were trying to find other ways to do it rather than just always a DB no finish. We felt like the combat knife finishing move was a way to do that.
So that's one of the biggest additions, is this defensive sort of alternative to mantle kicking. I think the most core thing to Gears is cover. That's number one. How can we make cover dynamic? How can we make the battlefield change?
You look at meat shielding, you look at the Mauler shield, like those are forms of dynamic cover, and we were like, how can we take that idea and push it even further in Gears of War 4? And that's what you see with pods and the nests.
So in Gears 4 we have these pods. You're always running this risk of when you decide to shoot a pod to take it away from the enemy, or if you're hiding behind a pod and it gets shot in front of you, every pod has a potential to have a juvie inside of it. Or it can be empty. Or it can have a screamer that can go off and pop all the pods around, that anti-jackpot that basically pops everything in the room, and then you're dealing with like 20 juvies all at once, and chances are you're not going to survive. For us, like, playing with wind came out of this desire to play with cover. So we have these wind flares. Basically the idea is like Sarah has been ravaged by weather since the emulsion was annihilated using the emulsion countermeasure. The way the planet has reacted is these massive weather patterns that create these wind flares that are like part tornado, part fire. Everything on Sarah is turned up to, 20.
It was really interesting to take this idea of this environmental element and then make it part of really interesting gameplay, to the point where when you get to the storm wall, it's this kind of its own boss fight. You're fighting the wind in this huge battle.
Those are all over our game. It's not like a one-off scripted thing that we did. It's an entire system that we built.
It's a really procedurally driven system that is really interesting in it. Bending your projectiles and throwing your grenades and having your grenade come back at you because you're throwing into the wind.
You'll notice that the enemies are also being affected by the wind. They're stumbling around, you can cut them out at the knees, and when you do kill somebody, you're gonna see them just rip off into the distance like they're in Twister. There are some big moments that you can trigger as a player in these wind flares, things that are in the world that are just waiting to be released. It might feel a little bit crazy as an idea, but honestly, like, Sarah has razor hail and giant Brumac monsters with guns strapped to them. Like, that's the liberating thing about Gears, right? It's got this grounded in military realism mixed with this over-the-top planet, over-the-top creatures, over-the-top moments.
One of the things that's sort of very different about this game is that it's not a sort of planet-wide battle or war again for the survival of humanity, at least not yet. The game is one night in the woods with these three characters trying to survive to find out what this new threat is. Like, what are these creatures that are taking people? Obviously we're shipping with split screen, again, because you gotta ship split screen. We're taking it from 4-player co-op back down to 2-player co-op. But one of the cool things is that we're actually introducing a selectable character for player 2. So player 1 is always JD, but player 2 can choose to be Kate or Del, and so you can go in and experience the game from their perspective. We wanted to be small and intimate again because we wanted you to get scared again. I mean, I could see where the battle has to grow. Like, eventually Gears of War, it's a war. It's not Gears of hiking or whatever. Like, it's like it needs to get to a war. But at the same point, I think there's a way to measure that so that it's not immediately too much and that you completely diminish the enemy.
I know we talk a lot about sort of returning to the tone and the mystery of Gears 1, but we also have 4 games worth of gameplay to look at. We're actually in a really cool position because we get to look at it and go, what is the best from all 4 of those games? And then we get to go, like, which of those do we want to make feel next gen? Which ones do we want to improve? Which ones do we want to innovate on? It's a really cool place to be.
I've been with the franchise for 10 years, and when I pick it up and play it, it feels like a Gears of War game to me. You're dealing with new tech, a new team, a new story, new gameplay. Like, there's so many new risks that are part of this process that at the end of the day, you want them to go like, oh, I'm playing Gears of War again.